She was just an alien prisoner, until the human guard whispered, "Run." They called her Subject A-17, though the name etched in her fractured memory was Aelari, a whisper of stars long forgotten, and her world was a sterile prison lined with steel and silence, hidden beneath the frost-bitten crust of Earth's outermost moon, Cold Reach 3. She had been here for what felt like cycles, time blurred beneath the flicker of synthetic lighting, the metallic taste of nutrient gel, the cold press of restraints around her wrists and ankles. Her cell was soundproofed not to protect her, but to protect the men in white coats from her voice, which, when she first arrived, had triggered every sensor and scrambled communications across the facility until they silenced it with sedatives and isolation. No one spoke to her. No one looked at her with anything but clinical calculation, as though she were a wild thing, a weapon, not a person with a name, a family, a purpose. That changed the day Miles Wren was assigned to security rotation at Corridor H9. He was a former frontline officer, reassigned after an injury left him slower on his left side, a fractured knee that still sang in the cold, and a bitterness that clung to him like smoke. He didn't care for the lab, didn't care for aliens, didn't care for much since the failed mission on Vela where half his squad died, and the rest were told to forget what they'd seen. Miles had learned to live by rules. Don't look too close. Don't ask too much, and above all, never interfere. But the girl, no, the alien in cell H9 unsettled him. Not because she looked monstrous, quite the opposite. Her skin shimmered faintly, an opalescent hue that seemed to shift, with the artificial lighting, and her eyes, a deep violet flecked with silver, weren't wild, weren't savage, but still, devastatingly still. She didn't rage like the others had. She didn't plead. She simply sat, day after day, watching the door, watching him. The first time he paused longer than necessary at the observation slit, she tilted her head, as if cataloging his face. The second time she tapped a rhythm on the wall. 3 beats, a pause, 2 more. Not random. A pattern. And it lodged in his head like a seed that wouldn't die. He asked the techs on level 3 what her species was. They shrugged. Something royal, maybe. DNA markers don't match any of the other Lissari captures. Could be a crossbreed. Doesn't matter. She won't last long. That phrase, she won't last long, needled him. At night, off-duty, he reviewed archived footage, redacted files he wasn't supposed to access. He found security tapes from her intake. Shackled, injured, not resisting, carrying something. A smaller figure, limp in her arms. Another Lissari, perhaps a child, perhaps kin. The footage cut off mid-frame. Miles dug deeper, bypassing firewalls with tricks he'd learned in the field. He found lab notes. Subject A-17 recovered from failed diplomatic vessel. Initial resistance minimal. Unregistered energy signatures upon arrival. Containment measures upgraded. Sedation protocols implemented. Companion deceased. Companion. The word sliced deeper than he expected. He returned. To his shift different the next day. When he passed her cell, he looked straight at her. She didn't blink, but her eyes glistened. The next time, he brought a cloth and quietly cleaned the observation window. She watched every movement, not like a prisoner, like someone remembering. Rebuilding. When the power grid flickered during a storm and the backup lights cast long shadows through the hall, he heard something. Soft, almost human. A whisper. He paused, listened. His breath caught. She was humming. A low melody, foreign but mournful, coming not from her lips but from her throat, layered in harmonics that tugged at something primal. He didn't report it. He didn't speak of it. That night he dreamed of a name, Aelari, and woke with it still on his tongue. On day 23 of his shift rotation, she finally moved. Not just shifted, moved to the wall and placed her palm against it. Slowly. Deliberately. He didn't know why, but he placed his hand on the other side. And then, clear as breath, she whispered through the reinforced glass, Miles. His blood turned to ice. He hadn't introduced himself. He hadn't even worn a name tag in weeks. He stepped back, heart hammering. The cameras. Were they watching? He risked a glance. The red light on the corner panel was off. System glitch from the storm, maybe. Maybe. He crouched low to avoid the central lens and leaned closer to the vent slits. How do you know that name? She pressed her forehead against the wall. Because once before the sky burned, you saved someone like me. The words shattered every wall he'd built. Vela. The girl on the field. The Lissari child he'd carried after the bombing, who vanished after evac. No records. No trace. He thought he'd imagined her, that he'd misremembered. He never spoke of it again. Until now. I didn't know, he began. But she closed her eyes. You forgot. It's what humans do. Miles didn't know what he was doing when he returned to the corridor after midnight. He knew it was against orders. He knew he could be reassigned, or worse. But something had changed. Aelari was no longer just a prisoner. She was a mirror of something he thought he'd lost, his soul. He brought her a real blanket, stolen from the unused infirmary, soft and warm. She took it without speaking, and her hands trembled. That night, when she curled into it like a child seeking safety, he stood guard long after his shift ended. The following days were a blur of half-spoken phrases, gestures, and careful risks. He brought her old books, children's picture books. At first, then ones with language. She read fast, too fast. She wasn't just intelligent, she was remembering. Restoring. He learned her true name. She taught him to pronounce it. Aelari. Not subject, not asset. Aelari. She said it meant echo of the stars. And slowly, painfully, she told him the truth. She was not a soldier. She was Lissari's youngest emissary, sent to Earth as a symbol of peace during the final round of pre-war diplomacy. The ship was sabotaged. Their escort was gunned down before even landing. She survived, barely. Her cousin, her only family, was killed in front of her. The humans who found her didn't identify her as diplomatic. They labeled her high risk, containment priority, experimentation approved. She said it flatly, without emotion. But her hands clenched when she described the cold steel table, the injections, the loss of voice, and Miles. Miles couldn't breathe. He saw her then not as a rescue or a cause, but as a person who had endured what no one should. And he realized something terrifying. She would die in that cell if he didn't act. Not immediately, but eventually. The scans showed it. The harmonics in her chest, the thing the humans thought was her alien power, was her life force, meant to resonate with her kin. Cut off for too long, it would decay, and her last song would be a death rattle. On day 37, he heard the new orders. Subject A-17 to be transferred to Black Sector. Full invasive protocol scheduled. No return, no record, no trial. Just a vanishing. He stared at the data pad, at the words, at the signature of the director. He heard his own voice before he knew what he was saying. I'll escort the transfer. The administrator nodded, unconcerned. The paperwork was signed. No one questioned him. They trusted his record, trusted his silence. That night at 02:14 during shift change, Miles keyed in the override code. The cell hissed open. She was already standing, no fear, just trust. He reached for her hand, not in command but in solidarity. And in a voice as soft as frost on glass, he whispered, "Run." The door opened with a sigh of air, soft and final, and for one suspended moment neither of them moved. Aelari stood motionless, eyes wide with the glow of disbelief, as if she had not truly believed freedom could be a real thing until now. Until Miles stood there like a fracture in the world she'd known. Not in uniform, but in a stolen gray thermal coat 2 sizes too big. Holding out a hand she had never been offered before. a hand not to pull her deeper into confinement but to pull her out, and when she stepped forward, it was with the weight of someone who had forgotten how to trust their own limbs. The corridor was dim, running on auxiliary power. He had timed it perfectly during the transition when the guard shifts overlapped, when the systems would be resetting and attention was at its most lax. And still, every step they took felt like thunder to Miles, his boots whispering against the composite floor while his pulse roared louder than alarms. Aelari walked beside him barefoot, silent, her stride unsteady at first but growing stronger as the sedatives wore off and her instinct returned, and as they passed each intersection, Miles flicked his eyes to the motion sensors he'd disabled earlier, praying the backdoor code he'd planted in the system a week ago still held. They slipped through the medbay access tunnel and into the maintenance shaft, a narrow crawlspace that reeked of coolant and dust, and she moved through it like smoke, folding her limbs with unnatural grace, her shimmering skin dull from weeks of captivity, but her eyes sharp now, alert. And when they reached the service ladder that plunged into the lower sublevels, she turned to him for the first time since stepping out of the cell, and whispered, "They'll hunt you too now." He met her gaze, and something old and broken in him stirred. He'd seen comrades die, orders followed blindly, but never before had he stood on the edge of treason and chosen it willingly. "I know," he said, "but I'm already lost." And without another word, he began the descent. Below, the forgotten underbelly of the base stretched like a maze of bones, unused storage chambers, archived supply rooms, old ventilation corridors no longer mapped in the central database, and it was there, among crates covered in frost and rust, that he led her to the old cargo module he had spent weeks preparing in secret, stocked with thermal blankets, protein packs, water canisters, and one thing more, an encrypted nav device, patched into an off-grid comm relay, designed for smugglers but repurposed now for something much more desperate. Aelari's hands trembled as she touched the device, tracing its interface, and Miles watched as she reactivated instincts long buried, accessing hidden frequencies, tapping in codes from a language humanity still claimed not to understand. "If I reach the edge of the interference field," she murmured, "I can send a signal home." Her voice was hoarse, barely audible, but it sparked something fierce beneath her tired eyes. "They might still hear me." Miles didn't ask who they were. He understood enough to know that if her people were alive, they would not abandon one of their own. The sound of distant boots echoed faintly from above. Too many. Too close. "We have to go," he said, tossing her a thermal hood, and together they slipped into the abandoned access lift and began their ascent toward the surface, a route once sealed after an accident but reopened by his hands days before, under the guise of maintenance. As the lift creaked and hummed its slow climb, he could feel the tension between them. Not distrust, not anymore, but the terrible knowledge that what they were doing was irreversible. Miles had never been a hero. He was a man haunted by orders he'd followed, silences he'd kept, things he'd seen and never dared question. But Aelari had made him remember who he used to be, the version of himself that still believed in protecting something fragile, something innocent, not because he was told to, but because it was right. They breached the surface just as the storm broke, a windstorm so fierce it rattled the lift cage and painted the sky in sheets of silver and ice. And as they stepped into the whirling gale, the cold hit them like a scream. Aelari staggered, unused to the planet's weather, but Miles caught her, pulling her close beneath his coat, and they ran, stumbling, gasping, blinded by snow, toward the edge of the old service yard, where an abandoned skimmer bike lay half-frozen beneath. A tarp. He had rigged it with a manual starter, and as he wrenched the engine to life, she crouched low behind him, hands wrapped around his waist, and together they plunged into the wasteland beyond the compound walls, fleeing into the endless white. Behind them, alarms shrieked to life, red lights piercing the snow haze, and Miles knew their time had begun to shrink. Every second counted now. The bike roared across ice plains and ravines, dodging security drones that blinked to life from their hibernation protocols, mechanical vultures scanning for heat signatures, and twice they had to veer sharply as high-pitched alert pings chased them like sirens. Aelari, sensing them before they crested ridges, shouted directions that made no sense to his ears but always led them to shelter, always one step ahead. They stopped only once at a jagged outcropping of obsidian rock to refuel and to breathe. She was shaking violently, not from cold, but from the buildup of pressure in her chest. He could hear it, the resonance, the hum of her inner frequency, fighting against the silence that had caged her for too long. "If I don't send the signal soon," she began, and her voice cracked. He crouched beside her, pressing the nav device into her palms. "Then send it," he said. She stared at him, something unreadable behind her eyes. "If I call them, they'll know I trusted a human." He met her gaze. "Then let them know one of us got something right." She hesitated, then activated the beacon, embedding her resonance into its pulse. A haunting, harmonic signal that didn't need words to speak pain, survival, and hope. It pierced the static of the storm, reaching into the sky like a cry from the edge of extinction. Miles didn't know if anyone heard it. He only knew that when she looked up, the fear in her expression had shifted, still terrified, but now accompanied by something else. Resolve. They rode for hours, navigating the wildlands between sectors, and every checkpoint they passed unseen felt like a borrowed miracle. He was no longer thinking about escape as a tactic. He was thinking about it as a promise, not just to her but to himself. Aelari began speaking more, now that they were beyond the walls, sometimes in English, sometimes in her own tongue, a language that sounded like wind chimes and rain, and when he asked her what she was saying, she replied, "Stories, the kind I was never allowed to finish." When night fell, they found shelter in a collapsed mining dome, half buried beneath snowdrifts, and inside, beneath flickering emergency lights, they huddled together for warmth. She asked him why he helped her, truly helped her, and for a long moment he said nothing. Then, "Because I saw you, and it made me remember I still had a choice." She nodded, and for the first time she reached for his hand without fear. As sleep claimed them both beneath the weight of exhaustion, above them the stars blinked through cracks in the dome's ceiling, indifferent witnesses to a bond forged not by orders or duty or survival, but by the quiet decision to see one another as more than what the world had told them to be. And far above, beyond the range of human satellites, something stirred, an answer to the beacon, faint and growing, drawn by the voice of a girl once caged, now running, and the human who had dared to run with her. The wind howled like a predator, chasing them, curling through the skeletal remnants of what once must have been a communications array, now nothing more than jagged steel ribs jutting from the ash-choked earth. The alien prisoner, Aelari, stumbled beside Kade, the human guard whose voice had broken centuries of silence in her soul with a single word: run. They hadn't stopped for more than a moment since slipping past the compound's shattered perimeter and diving into the no-man's land beyond. This was no forest of nature, but a graveyard of machines and war wreckage, a rusting maze called the Forest of Steel by locals, and for good reason. Towering husks of derelict drones leaned like decaying, trees tangled metal vines snared at their feet, and every echo felt like a footstep behind them. Kade moved with grim purpose, his sidearm holstered but within easy reach, his stolen credentials blinking red with each unauthorized sector they passed. Aelari moved quietly, too quietly for someone who had barely known freedom. Her training, bred into her species from generations of survival, had kicked in the moment she passed the outer wall. She might not have been raised for war, but she had learned how to vanish into shadows. Kade noticed it too, glancing at her as they crouched beneath the shattered wing of an old Federation dropship. "You've done this before," he murmured, barely loud enough to carry over the wind. She met his eyes, not with pride, but something closer to shame. "Escaping?" she said. "No, but hiding? That's all we were ever taught once the cages came." Kade didn't reply. What could he say? That he'd seen the cages? That he had walked past her cell every day for months and only now dared to act? The guilt festered like an untreated wound. Every time she winced or looked back with eyes full of silent panic, he felt the weight of his hesitation press harder on his chest. They waited until a patrol drone buzzed overhead, its red scanner slicing through the wreckage like a blade. Aelari reached out and tugged him down just in time, the pulse narrowly missing them. For a moment, they lay face down in a shallow trench, heartbeats pounding, breath fogging the chill air between them. When the drone passed, Kade let out a low whistle. "You're better at this than me," he muttered. She smirked, a small, almost bitter expression. "I've had more practice staying alive without anyone noticing." They moved again, weaving between twisted pylons and shattered cargo crates. The world out here was no friendlier than the prison they'd left behind, just more open, more uncertain. The Federation's outer sectors had long been abandoned, and yet they were full of eyes. Old tech scavengers, rogue sentries still obeying, ancient commands, and worse, informants paid to turn in fugitives for rations or safety. Kade knew they couldn't keep running like this, not without a plan and not without rest. His stolen datapad beeped faintly, blinking up a message from a contact code he had dared to activate only once. A smuggler named Vex, the only one crazy, enough to agree to an extraction this deep in former war zone territory. The message was brief and brutal. Docking point moved. Meet at Crater 9. 20 hours. Don't be late. Don't get followed. Kade showed it to Aelari, who looked at the pad with wary eyes. "Can we trust him?" she asked. Kade grimaced. "No, but we don't have many choices." She nodded once, accepting the truth. Choices were a luxury. Survival was a necessity. As night fell, the temperature dropped sharply, and they found a shelter inside the belly of a crashed freighter that had snapped in half years ago. It smelled of burned insulation and damp oil, but the metal walls gave some protection from drones and the cold. Kade lit a small heat cell, careful to shield the glow. Aelari sat opposite him, her silvery skin catching the light in soft pulses, her large, luminous eyes watching him with an intensity he didn't fully understand. "Why did you do it?" she asked suddenly. "Why help me?" He hesitated, the fire flickering in his irises as he searched for an answer that could survive the weight of her truth. "Because I should have a long time ago," he said finally. "Because I saw what they were doing to you, and I was tired of pretending I didn't." She nodded, but her silence carried more questions. How many others had seen? How many had chosen to look away? Kade didn't ask about her past, though he wanted to. Instead, he offered her the last of his ration bar. She took it, hesitated, then broke it in half and gave the other piece back. It was a small gesture, but one that said more than words could. As the wind howled outside, they took turns resting, one always awake, always listening. In the dead hours before dawn, Aelari finally spoke again. "They took everything from me, my sisters, my name, my voice. I don't know what I'm running toward, only what I'm running from." Kade reached across and gently touched her hand, not as a soldier, but as someone who understood loss. "Then we'll figure it out together," he said. "Starting with getting you to that crater." By morning, the forest of steel was cloaked in fog, a gray veil that muffled sound and light. They moved through it like ghosts, careful, quiet, coordinated now. Where Kade's military instincts faltered in the unpredictable terrain, Aelari adapted, sensing heat signatures from sentries before they saw them, listening to vibrations that eluded Kade's human hearing. In one moment, she grabbed him by the collar and yanked him backward just before a pressure mine clicked beneath his foot. "You're welcome," she whispered as he stared, pale-faced, at the almost triggered device. "Remind me not to doubt you again," he breathed. But their progress came to a halt near midday, when they heard shouting. Not soldiers, but scavengers. 3 humans in tattered gear, rifles slung over their shoulders, arguing loudly over something half buried in debris. Kade cursed under his breath. "We can't go around without losing hours." Aelari studied them for a moment, her body tense, then nodded slowly. "Then we go through, quietly." They slipped down a side path, keeping low, their footsteps muffled on ash and metal, But luck like silence only held so long. One of the scavengers caught sight of movement and raised an alarm. "Hey, over there!" Kade pulled Aelari behind a shattered bulkhead, his weapon drawn. "Stay behind me," he hissed, and for once she obeyed. The fight was short, but brutal. Kade's training took down two quickly, but the third managed to land a glancing shot that tore through his shoulder, sending him to one knee. Blood soaked his sleeve. Aelari didn't scream. She picked up the scavenger's dropped pistol and fired a warning shot into the sky, sending the survivor running. Then she dropped beside Kade, her hands already pressing against the wound, her voice low and fierce. "You don't get to die here. Not now. Not after this." He gritted his teeth against the pain. "Remind me to let you lead next time." She almost smiled, tears in her eyes. They bound the wound as best they could and kept moving. Slower, now every step a risk. But they didn't stop. Couldn't stop. Because somewhere out there was Crater 9, and with it, maybe a future neither of them had dared to believe in. By nightfall, the fog had lifted and the sky was clear, too clear. Stars glittered above them, but so did the blinking lights of drones. Crater 9 lay ahead, vast and dark, its edges glowing faintly from residual energy. A skiff waited near. The far side, Vex's by the look of it. The smuggler stood by it, smoking something that glowed blue. "Took your time," he called. "And you brought a guest, pretty one too." Kade raised his weapon. "She goes with me. You get paid when we're safe." Vex laughed, but waved them on. Yeah, come aboard. You're lucky I like you, Kade." As they stepped onto the skiff, Aelari paused, glancing back at the forest of steel, where she'd almost died and almost found herself. Kade stood beside her, still bleeding, but alive. "Next stop?" he asked. She looked at him, and for the first time since she'd been captured, her voice was steady. "Someplace I get to choose." The skiff roared to life, lifting into the night, leaving the cage and everything that made her a prisoner far behind. The skiff cut through the atmosphere like a blade, its thrusters vibrating beneath Aelari's feet as they sped away from the bleak, suffocating expanse of the forest of steel. The dull throb of the engines was the only sound for a long while, the distant stars their only company. Aelari leaned back, allowing herself a breath that wasn't filled with the stale air of captivity. It had been years since she'd been able to simply breathe without fear of someone hearing her, of someone coming for her. And yet, as the night sky stretched endlessly before them, she couldn't shake the feeling that even in her newfound freedom she wasn't truly free. Not yet. Not until she understood what freedom really meant. Beside her, Kade was quiet, his face pale and drawn. The pain from his shoulder wound only just beginning to ebb as the skiff's medical system worked to heal him. His gaze was fixed on the stars, distant and haunted. He hadn't spoken much. Since they left the forest, his mind undoubtedly lost in the same tumult of thoughts that Aelari herself wrestled with. She knew the look, the haunted silence. She had seen it in the eyes of others, those who survived long enough to escape but not without scars. Physical scars faded. The mental ones, the ones that festered beneath the surface, those never truly healed. "You okay?" she asked, her voice soft. It was an odd question to ask, considering the chaos of the past few days, but she needed to know. Needed to understand if he too felt the weight of what they had done, of what they were still doing. Kade didn't turn to look at her at first, but she could see the way his jaw clenched. "Yeah," he replied finally, his voice rough, as if he hadn't used it in a long time. "Just thinking." She didn't push him. Some things, Aelari had learned, couldn't be forced into words. It was better to let them simmer in silence, to wait until the time came when they were ready to speak. She turned her gaze back to the endless expanse of stars. Each of those lights was a reminder of what had been lost. Her people, her home, her family. She had been a princess. She had once walked among the elite, trained to rule with grace and wisdom. That life felt so distant now, as if it belonged to someone else entirely. But I am still here, and I can still fight. The thought steadied her. grounding her in the moment. She could still make something of this second chance. She wasn't going to let her past define her. Not anymore. The silence between them stretched, but this time it didn't feel suffocating. Instead, it was a fragile kind of peace, a space where both of them could catch their breath. But it didn't last long. The smuggler, Vex, who had been busy at the controls, shouted from the cockpit, "We're coming up on the first checkpoint." His voice cut through the quiet like a knife, jolting Aelari from her thoughts. "Better. Hold on. Things are going to get rough." Kade cursed softly, a hand instinctively going to his sidearm. "We should have known." Aelari stood quickly, steadying herself as the skiff dipped and swerved, the turbulence growing more violent with each passing second. She wasn't accustomed to this kind of flight, not the erratic dodging and weaving of a smuggler trying to avoid detection. She could feel the pull of the artificial gravity shifting beneath her feet. Her heart raced as her mind flitted back to the Federation, their radar, their constant search. The danger wasn't over. It had only just begun. "Kade," she said, urgently, "they'll be after us soon. This ship, this route, isn't secure. They'll be tracking us." Kade looked over at her, his eyes sharp despite the exhaustion. "Not if we can lose them in the asteroid field. Just stay down and let me handle it." He moved to the rear compartment preparing his weapon, but Aelari felt a surge of unease. Vex's ship was too small to outrun anything that came after them, and the Federation was relentless. The smuggler wasn't their salvation. He was just a stop along the way. The stars beyond their viewport seemed to stretch in every direction as they neared the asteroid field, a deadly maze of floating rocks that had once served as a natural defense against Federation patrols. But it wasn't just a natural defense. It was a graveyard, a silent testament to the price of resistance. The Federation had obliterated anyone who had tried to use it as a shield in the past. Now, Aelari understood, the field wasn't just a safe haven. It was a tomb. Vex swerved, his ship shaking violently as he maneuvered through the field, his hands a blur over the controls. Hold tight," he yelled. Aelari braced herself, her heart pounding as the skiff darted between massive chunks of rock. Some of them were big enough to destroy the ship on impact. There was no room for error, and yet, every minute that passed, Aelari felt the ship tremble with the certainty that it wouldn't hold much longer. Then, as they were nearing the densest part of the field, a sharp alarm blared from the cockpit. Vex cursed under his breath, his face pale as he slammed the emergency switch. "Shit! They've locked onto us. Federation has found us." I knew it was too good to be true. Kade's eyes flicked to the horizon, scanning the stars. "We need to lose them. Now." The skiff dipped sharply, careening through the asteroid field with dangerous speed. Aelari's stomach lurched as she clung to the nearest seat, her breath shallow. She could hear the faint hum of Federation ships, faster, more advanced and closing in. They were only minutes away from the skiff, and the odds of escaping were slipping away with each passing second. She wasn't accustomed to this kind of flight, not the erratic dodging and weaving of a smuggler trying to avoid detection. She could feel the pull of the artificial gravity shifting beneath her feet. Her heart raced as her mind flitted back to the Federation, their radar, their constant search. The danger wasn't over. It had only just begun. "Kade," she said urgently, "they'll be after us soon. This ship, this route, isn't secure. They'll be tracking us." Kade looked over at her, his eyes sharp despite the exhaustion. "Not if we can lose them in the asteroid field. Just stay down and let me handle it." He moved to the rear compartment, preparing his weapon, but Aelari felt a surge of unease. Vex's ship was too small to outrun anything that came after them, and the Federation was relentless. The smuggler wasn't their salvation, he was just a stop along the way. The stars beyond their viewport seemed to stretch in every direction as they neared the asteroid field, a deadly maze of floating rocks that had once served as a natural defense against Federation patrols. But it wasn't just a natural defense. It was a graveyard, a silent testament to the price of resistance. The Federation had obliterated anyone who had tried to use it as a shield in the past. Now, Aelari understood. The field wasn't just a safe haven. It was a tomb. Vex swerved, his ship shaking violently as he maneuvered through the field, his hands a blur over the controls. Hold tight, he yelled. Aelari braced herself, her heart pounding as the skiff darted between massive chunks of rock. Some of them were big enough to destroy the ship on impact. There was no room for error, and yet every minute that passed, Aelari felt the ship tremble with the certainty that it wouldn't hold much longer. Then, as they were nearing the densest part of the field, a sharp alarm blared from the cockpit. Vex cursed under his breath, his face pale as he slammed the emergency switch. Shit! They've locked onto us. Federation has found us. I knew it was too good to be true. Kade's eyes flicked to the horizon, scanning the stars. We need to lose them, now. The skiff dipped sharply, careening through the asteroid field with dangerous speed. Aelari's stomach lurched as she clung to the nearest seat, her breath shallow. She could hear the faint hum of Federation ships, faster, more advanced and closing in. They were only minutes away from the skiff, and the odds of escaping were slipping away with each passing second. Think. Aelari's mind raced, her body moving without thought. She had no weapons, no way to fight. All she had was the one thing the Federation never seemed to account for, her ability to survive. As the Federation ship drew closer, she made a decision, one that would change everything. Kade, she shouted. He turned, his eyes wide with panic. What are you? She didn't wait for him to finish. Aelari moved quickly, her hands flying over the controls as she initiated the emergency eject sequence for the rear hatch. The hatch opened with a loud snap, and before Kade could react, she dove out into the darkness of space. The vacuum swallowed her whole, the stars now cold and distant. She had no plan, no backup. But she had something the Federation couldn't track, herself. She activated the suit's emergency thrusters, her body propelled by the faint push of the jetpack attached to her back. Her only goal was to get lost in the debris, to disappear among the shattered remnants of space. For a long moment, everything was silent. She could hear nothing, feel nothing except the steady pulse of her own heartbeat. Then, just as she had hoped, the Federation ship passed her by. They had locked onto the skiff, not her. And with that, she was invisible. As she drifted, waiting for her heart to slow, Aelari couldn't help but smile. She was free. In a way, she had never been before. The stars seemed to shine a little brighter, the cold vacuum of space a little less suffocating. There was hope now, a new beginning, somewhere, out there, in the depths of the galaxy. She would find it. She had to. The question was, what would Kade do without her? But for now, she didn't know. All she knew was that she had outrun the Federation, and for the first time in her life, she was the one in control. The universe, it seemed, was finally hers to conquer.